From the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out. I'm joined by Richard Lim, who's the host of This American President podcast. He joins me today to talk a little bit about the coronavirus and a little bit about our history. Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Richard, first of all, before we get into this little historical discussion, what exactly is your goal and mission when you started This American President?
Well, so it's really in two parts. The first is personal. I've always been a history geek. I was the kid that whose mom took him to the library, and I would read history while everyone else was watching movies. And when I was working in Washington, sometimes you work jobs that you don't actually get to do what you're passionate about. And on my free time, I would read about history. And it just kind of occurred to me, what's the point of studying all this stuff if you can't share it with people? Mm-hmm. And I had a friend who wanted to start a podcast. He knew all the technical side of things, what equipment to buy and everything. And we decided to join forces, and now we're doing our podcast. So that's the personal side. On the, I guess, the public side, basically, history has so many lessons to offer, and there's really nothing new under the sun, as they say, or, I think they say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so oftentimes we face similar challenges. And I think we're just better off as a country and a society knowing where we came from.
So, I mean, I listen to the podcast. I think it's wonderful. And I've become a pretty big history buff myself. But kind of getting a little bit more into the topic that we want to discuss with respect to the coronavirus, just want to get your frame of mind here and your perspective. And when you look at how the federal government has been handling the coronavirus outbreak in the United States, has there been anything in particular that stood out to you?
Well, the federal government is huge, so obviously you're going to have the hallmarks of that. You're going to have a lot of bureaucracy. You're going to have a lot of overregulation. There's a reason why people are criticizing the CDC for not responding quickly enough. One thing I think is a good parallel is 9/11, the other great event of our lifetimes. And the 9/11 report, when it looked back at what had happened and how there was such a big intelligence failure, said that it was a failure of imagination. We just couldn't imagine something like this happen. Mm-hmm. And I think in the same way, that's a parallel to the coronavirus. Most people honestly couldn't imagine something like this happening, where a virus spreads around the world and the world's economy shuts down. But again, that goes back to the failure of imagination. So it's really government being so big, being so bureaucratic, and failing to respond. The other thing, too, is that there's honestly a lot of politicization. That's not surprising. But right now you're hearing people talk about how we have a choice as we restart the economy. We have a choice between opening up, but that would cause millions of people to die if the disease resurges, or having to keep a blanket shutdown and destroy the economy. And I think that's just political posturing. It's really a false choice. The American people have responded with a lot of ingenuity. I mean, I hear stories of kids using 3D printers to print out face masks. And I think people will find a way to survive this. And the right approach is to empower people and to let the local and state governments decide what to do. And the federal government has a role to play, can give guidance, but they should really allow the people and small business owners to determine whether they've met that standard and those guidance.
Yeah, and I know probably for our listeners who were hearing that, and you talk about how 9/11 was a great event. I know you mean not in like a positive way,
no,
but
of course.
It was just so enormous and so catastrophic and tragic that it lasted. Its lasting impact was just in terms of the magnitude. Coronavirus is similar in that regard. I also knew what you meant, but for our listeners who might get it confused, I figured at least clarify the error. But yeah, focusing on the response in particular, taking a look back through history since our country's founding, you look at the American Revolutionary War, you have the smallpox outbreak, and then you have the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, in the early 20th, obviously in the early 20th century. That's a span of, I mean, we're looking back 250 years almost.
Mhm.
Has there been any similarities or differences that stood out to you, in how we responded to those particular diseases?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that because both of those situations happened during wartime. And so obviously during wartime, there are a lot of different priorities, and people look at civil liberties a little bit differently during that time. But as far as the American Revolution, there are a lot of parallels with today. General George Washington, who was the commander of the Continental Army, took very similar responses. He basically closed off contact with his army and with any foreign actors because of fear of the disease spreading. In fact, the British were actually weaponizing various diseases, including smallpox, and so they would send soldiers back to American populations in hopes of weakening them and having the disease spread. So Washington cut that off, similar to what the federal government and the administration has done today. A big difference, though, is the fact that at the state and local level, you had a lot more control. Back then, states were more like countries, independent units. And so they really left it up to states and local areas to determine, whether a business would keep going. Individual households would put up flags, red flags that would indicate that this house is infected. And so in that sense, there are a lot of lessons that are parallel to today. One of my good friends, Logan Byrne, who's an author, actually did a lot of research on this, and he's writing an op-ed that covers a lot of this stuff. As far as the Spanish flu, I think that the response was very different, and that mainly centers around censorship. Basically, the Wilson administration made it illegal to talk about the war, and they wanted to stop anything that hampered the war effort. And talking about a disease could introduce fears that the country was being weakened. And so they basically didn't allow them to talk about that, which is pretty incredible. I mean, imagine, if that happened today, if the government, all the lawsuits that would have happened. But apparently at the time, that's the way it was. And there's a really awful story about how Philadelphia, the city officials knew about the Spanish flu, but they allowed a parade to go on, which was basically, it was like a war bond drive. And before you know it, the disease spread, the flu spread, and thousands of people died. And, again, imagine if that happened today. So it was very different, a lot more censorship. It's funny that 200 years ago, we seem to have more parallels than something that happened 100 years ago.
Yeah, and that's also interesting. I mean, you bring up with the Philadelphia War Bond Parade. I mean, you don't even have to imagine it. Just look at, say, the Lunar New Year, the Chinese New Year
Mm-hmm.
in January, and this big push from some Democrats to have people go out and enjoy the festivities in a crowded area or a crowded
Right.
space with thousands of other people, not knowing the type of disease that was spread, knowing full well that coronavirus was sort of creeping up. And it wasn't by that time in late January, you didn't have any cases at the moment, but as soon as February hit, that's when things started to turn sideways. I mean, you bring up President Woodrow Wilson with the Sedition Act, and specifically because he thought that talking about the war would hurt the war effort. There's one thing that's interesting in the sense that and at least according to one historian that you noted to me, I believe it was by the name of, I'm looking at
John
my
Barry.
notes, John Barry. So
Yes.
John Barry, you said uh, that both Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Roosevelt, who was not president at the time, obviously, but Wilson
Right.
was, both contracted Spanish flu. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, it's really remarkable to think that the leader of the country got that disease at a time when literally millions of people were dying by that disease, and more Americans died of the Spanish flu. 5 times more Americans died in the Spanish flu than died in World War One, which had just happened. So yeah, this very deadly disease, and it was no respecter of persons. It was hitting everybody, including the president of the United States. The amazing thing too about it is that very few people knew about it. Now there is some debate about whether Wilson actually got it, but John Barry, who's an authority on the Spanish flu, believes that he did. And it's fascinating because the public didn't really know about it. They were able to hide it. And remember, Wilson and FDR were two presidents that were masters at hiding their affliction. Everyone remembers now that FDR had polio, but most people didn't know how bad his disease was. And so essentially they hid this disease. The president, his doctor was basically giving optimistic reports. It's just a cold, whatever. But what's fascinating about that is that it actually affected his judgment, because after he got this disease, after he got the flu, he started behaving erratically. This was when he was deciding on the post-war world and helping to influence the peace that would happen after World War I. And he originally wanted a soft peace towards Germany, not to punish them too much. When he got the flu, he behaved erratically. Then he joined in the effort to punish Germany. As we know, that later led Germany to become resentful and to a desire for revenge, which fueled World War II. It's very possible this Spanish flu has a connection to everything that happened afterwards, including the rise of Hitler. A lot of other factors were involved there, but it's very possible that this played a huge role. It's a real warning about the political implications of an influenza, a pandemic, any kind of health issue like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something that, I mean, we obviously know the sort of lasting impact Woodrow Wilson had on sort of American history after him, the legacy he left. But it's interesting. I never really knew about the Spanish flu, if he had contracted it, what his, obviously this is like based on one historian's account.
Sure.
And it's not widely enough thought to be consensus, but it's an interesting theory for sure. But I mean, you talk about the public's knowledge of both Woodrow Wilson and FDR having, specific diseases while they were in office. If the public obviously knew that, say, the president of the United States, in this case being President Donald Trump, contracted coronavirus, I mean, how do you think that would go?
Well, honestly, heaven forbid that any kind of chaos like that would happen. But obviously, we don't live in a time where presidents can hide that the way they did before. I think it would raise immediate questions of succession, according to the 25th Amendment passed in the aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination. And so at that point, you would have a situation where the vice president or the cabinet would have to really step up and make a decision about whether the president would be able to discharge his duties. Oftentimes, when there's a health issue, the president essentially allows the vice president to become the acting president. And that's happened before. It happened when President Bush was going through surgery and Vice President Cheney took over for a little bit. Most people don't even remember that. It happened pretty quickly. Obviously, coronavirus possibly has more graver implications. And at that point, the onus would really be on the president, the vice president, and the cabinet to have a very clear plan of what to do and what situation the president would allow the vice president to be the acting president and then would basically take on the duties again. So hopefully that, it won't ever come to that.
Right.
But that's something that they have to be prepared for if it does. Otherwise, you have one party saying, I'm okay, and the other party saying, I'm not okay. It's not a good place to be.
Yeah. I mean, specifically within the last week, we've seen reports about how there have been a number of White House officials who've contracted or tested positive for coronavirus. Even if there are symptoms, even if they might be asymptomatic or they might not be going through the ringer, that's still obviously a big deal.
Yep.
just in the last like month or so, you had Georgia Governor Brian Kemp acknowledge that he didn't recognize or didn't realize that asymptomatic carriers of coronavirus could still transmit it to another person.
Hmm.
Which I don't know how you get into that. I don't know how you think like that before, or what information you had available to you that made you not aware of that. But I
It's a little
mean,
scary.
yeah. I mean, we didn't have to look that far back to understand sort of the chaos in which a head of state, contracted coronavirus. We could just look at Boris Johnson, the prime minister of the British government,
Yep.
to kind of get us a good idea of how people will react, say, if President Trump were to contract coronavirus, God forbid.
Hmm.
I mean, from what we've seen, what you've observed, how was sort of the reaction to Boris Johnson getting coronavirus? And his situation got bad too. He went to the intensive care
Hmm.
unit.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, well, it's not funny, but it's interesting because you kind of had this cascade of more and more people getting it, and a lot of these people, I mean, when Tom Hanks was announced that he had it, it was kind of like, oh, this is real. And
Right.
then from then on, Boris Johnson, maybe the highest level political figure to get it, but by then it was almost like who hadn't gotten it,
Yeah.
so I think it's a measure of again, this obviously viruses are no respecter of persons, especially when you have people that are meeting thousands of people every day.
Yeah.
When Wilson got it, it wasn't just him. There were actually other people in the White House and his staff that got it. He probably got it from them. And so again, this isn't something that doesn't happen. I mean, it's happened before in history, but it underscores really how scary and difficult this situation is.
Yeah, I mean, going back a little bit to say the smallpox outbreak during the American Revolutionary War, a couple interesting points that you brought up. For one, for every soldier killed in battle, 10 more die from disease.
Yeah.
And that was just striking to me. I mean, what was the impact that smallpox really had? Because you mentioned obviously a few aspects, how George Washington isolated his troops from and like cut off foreign actors, and how smallpox was weaponized in a way. I mean, like it was just one of many viruses at the time, but obviously the most prevalent.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things that our generation, we've benefited from the fact that there have been so many vaccines that have come out that have eradicated things like smallpox, polio. When we talk about the founding era, pretty much any time before the 20th century or midway through the 20th century, you're talking about a time when there was very high infant mortality rates. When people talk about the lifespan back then, it was so low mainly because of high infant mortality rates. And so when you look at that, it's a totally different world. It's a world where life was definitely hanging on a thread. And I think that that's one of the biggest differences then versus now. Now, this is such a shocking thing because we haven't really had to worry about this. Yes, we heard about SARS, we heard about bird flu, H1N1, but those were things that happened, somewhere in different part of the world. And yet now it's happening here. And so that's why it's such a shock to us. One other thing about the American Revolution, it was really a twist of luck in many ways because George Washington had actually gotten smallpox as a boy. He had traveled to Barbados because he went with his brother who was sick. People back then thought that if you went to places like Barbados, you could get healed. And he actually contracted smallpox there, which was a blessing because it made him immune to it. And it led him to realize that if you inoculate your troops, it would actually help you. It would give you immunity, something that not everyone believed in back then.
What do you
And
mean?
so,
And just to
yeah,
give people an understanding, for those who are not really familiar, what do you mean by inoculating or
yeah,
inoculation?
basically they would expose them to a mild form of the disease, and it was risky because there were people that died from being inoculated, but then most people would then have immunity from it by being exposed. And of course, it's nothing like it was today. Today, everything's so sterilized and things like that. But back then, it would be a rather crude method that they would basically cut open, give you a little cut and then apply a bit of kind of a lower intensity form of the disease and hope that you wouldn't get it full blown. You would still get sick, but not to a certain level. Now, I'm just speaking from what I know. I'm not a doctor, obviously. There's
Right,
probably
right, right.
someone that can explain that, but that's from what I understood. And it was considered a pretty radical procedure, but you could argue that it saved the country because had that not happened, the army would have been decimated, and perhaps the United States would never have won independence as a result of that decision. There are a lot of historians that say that that was more important than any military decision Washington ever made.
Shifting gears a little bit to the Spanish flu pandemic, because you talk about sort of the impact historically that it could have had, say, on Woodrow Wilson's thinking
Mhm.
with respect to how he approached Germany after the First World War. But culturally, what did the Spanish flu really leave on not only the United States but the rest of the world?
Sure. Well, so it's actually quite fascinating as far as the United States goes, because the Spanish flu happened not just at the end of World War One, but it also happened at the end of the Progressive Era. And so during the Progressive Era of Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, you had a lot of social, economic change. Government was doing more than it had ever done before. That was when government started busting trusts, regulating. Woodrow Wilson wanted America to lead the League of Nations, so he wanted us to go from isolationist to internationalist. Um, and then the war was exhausting. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed in that, many more injured. And then you had the Spanish flu on top of that. It's just one after another of these challenges that really strained and taxed the American people. So when the 1920 election happened, instead of continuing with progressivism, they went back to conservatism. Warren Harding won the presidency campaigning on a return to normalcy.
Hmm.
And it's quite fascinating because you basically have the flu, which added to this sense of this is just too crazy. Things are, and remember, this is a time when radios and airplanes and cars and electricity was starting to get part of everyday life. And so you had so many changes that people felt overwhelmed and they wanted to go back to the good old days. They went conservative.
Yeah.
And so I think the flu really influenced that kind of direction in the country. It turned them isolationist. And what happened then is that led America to have this kind of conservative interlude before Franklin Roosevelt came, and he used the Depression to start imposing all the progressive ideals. And so it really had a lot of political implications in that respect. I think culturally it kind of added to this sense of exhaustion. And I think the same thing probably happened in the rest of the world. And one of the tragic things about that period is that it left so many questions unresolved that led to World War II. And I think especially internationally, when you have a disease ravaging like that, economies can't get back on their feet. So
Yeah.
people are starving, people are desperate. Who do they turn to? In America, we turn to conservative administration. In Europe, they turn to strongmen. They turn to the Mussolinis and eventually Hitler. And so it's very unfortunate how that happened. I would say that the Spanish flu had far worse consequences than we imagine. You can measure it in terms of immediate loss of life, staggering. But imagine what that meant in the long run, contributing to people like these fascist regimes. It's really an incredible story.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking, obviously, following the aftermath of the Spanish flu pandemic, you look at the 1920s, while there are
Hmm.
conservative administrations in place, like Warren G. Harding,
Hmm.
you have this roaring 20s era. You have prohibition. You
Hmm.
have, obviously, by the end of the decade, you have the stock market crash that leads into the Great Depression. All these things that sort of bubbled up to the surface, and I feel like we don't even really fully know what's in store ahead of us going forward. Obviously, you hope for the best, but
Hmm.
I'm sure there are a lot of people who are planning for the worst. And I guess like in your from what we've learned from history, what can you say or what can you look at or observe and be like, these are things that we can obviously learn from going forward, and maybe we should consider adapting it.
Right. Well, there are always silver linings to tragedies even. And so as awful as the pandemic is, I think what's interesting if you look at the statesmen that we had in World War One versus the statesmen we had in World War Two, most historians say that World War One, pretty weak statesmanship. There's not a lot of praise for the people that ran those wars. But then World War II comes along, and then that's when you have the Churchills. That's when you have people. Whatever one thinks of FDR, he was a strong leader in terms of being a war leader, and the reason I think is because they had the lessons of World War One to learn from. They went through that crucible, and they were more prepared for World War II. So I think partly there should be a sense of optimism that we're learning to adapt. We're learning that things happen that are unpredictable that you have to be prepared to change and disrupt your lifestyle for. So I have a sense of optimism there. I have a sense of optimism that as bad as things must have looked in 1919 for the United States, better days were ahead. In fact, the nation was about to embark within a few decades on being the world's superpower and unprecedented prosperity and social change for the better. Not always for the better, but often for the better. And
Right.
so, really, America's best days were ahead of it. And I think we should have that kind of optimism. The other lesson, I think, is that at the end of World War One, you had a lot of blame on Germany. And basically, Germany was grounded into dust as much as the Allies could do. But
Right.
that led to all these resentments, and people didn't realize how interdependent they were with the German economy. And cooperation may have been better. And so I think that there rightly is a lot of blame on China for hiding the extent of this virus and robbing the world of a few months of being able to prepare.
Mhm.
A lot of their officials have lied, and so they should be held accountable. But at the same time, it should be done in a constructive way that acknowledges just how interdependent our economies are. And only that way can we avoid any kind of unnecessary conflicts in the future. And lastly, it's so important that people seek good information and that they discern what's truth from untruth. I mean, there's so many theories that are going on right now and assumptions, but John Barry wrote in his book, the strongest weapon against a pandemic is the truth, more than uh, what do you call it, a vaccine.
Mhm.
And so I think being able to discern that as much as possible is the best information we have so that governments can't lie about this.
Well, Richard Lim, host of This American President podcast, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.